In Victorian England, what you ate showed exactly who you were in society. The rich threw banquets with up to 12 courses, while working-class families survived on stale bread and potatoes for weeks on end. Hunger was real even at the height of the British Empire. But then refrigerated ships arrived, bringing cheap meat from Argentina and Australia. That changed everything. Subscribe to see how this change transformed everything. Number 1. In Victorian England, eating meat was a rich person's luxury. Farm workers lived on bread, potatoes, and cheese, day after day, with no change. Sounds boring, right? But there was an interesting detail. This simple diet, based on what the land provided, was often healthier than what factory workers in industrial cities ate. While London grew dirty and chaotic, the countryside worker was still picking cabbage and onions from their own backyard. It wasn't plenty, but it kept the family going. The funny thing is that decades later, modern nutritionists would call this natural eating. Sometimes poverty teaches lessons that wealth forgets. Number 2. In Victorian England, the working class faced a brutal reality at the table. A typical breakfast consisted of stale bread soaked in animal fat, reused from butcher shops. This mixture, called dripping, was the main source of calories for millions of workers. Tea, watered down several times to make it last longer, rounded out the meal. With that in their stomachs, men and women faced shifts of up to 14 hours in factories with no ventilation. Life expectancy in the industrial areas of Manchester fell to a mere 17 years for the working class. While the aristocracy enjoyed 12-course banquets, workers spent up to 80% of their wages just to keep from starving. Number 3. In the Victorian era, the potato saved, and at the same time doomed, millions of workers. In the factories of industrial England, workers lived on boiled potatoes for entire weeks. It was cheap and filled you up. The problem? No meat, no fresh vegetables, no vitamin C. The result was frightening. Scurvy outbreaks right in London, a disease sailors had already figured out decades earlier. Bleeding gums, teeth falling out, wounds that wouldn't heal. Doctors at the time were baffled to see sailors' symptoms in workers who had never set foot on a ship. The irony is brutal. The same food that kept families alive was slowly making them sick. Number 4. In Victorian London, street vendors ruled the streets with carts full of fruits and vegetables. What's interesting is that poor people at the time ate up to 8 servings of fresh produce a day. Onions, cabbages, and seasonal apples were cheap and plentiful. Researchers found something surprising. This simple diet was more nutritious than a lot of the processed food we eat today. Without refrigeration or supermarkets, people depended on these vendors, who woke up before dawn to pick up goods at the central markets. It was a system that had worked for generations, feeding millions of urban workers with food that went straight from the countryside to the table in a matter of hours. Number 5. In Victorian England, having meat on the table for a poor family was almost an event. Most people could only afford pig's feet or organ meats, and even that maybe once a week if they were lucky. The rest of the time, smoked herring saved the day. And here's something curious. Canned sardines were just starting to show up in the markets, a technological novelty at the time. To stretch the food, housewives became masters at making thin soup last for days. Meanwhile, the British aristocracy ate roast beef every night. 2 completely different Englands existed side by side. Number 6. In Victorian England, drinking beer wasn't a matter of taste. It was a matter of survival. The water in cities could kill you, contaminated by sewage and diseases like cholera. So everyone drank beer, from the lord to the laborer. In 1900, each Brit drank an average of 32 gallons a year. Manual workers drank weaker versions during their shift, getting extra calories to make it through 12-hour workdays. Kids drank it too. It sounds crazy today, but back then it was simply the safest liquid available from the taps of industrial civilization. Number 7. In Victorian England, alcohol wasn't just for fun. It was almost a basic survival staple. Manual laborers believed beer gave them the strength to get through grueling days in the factories. The temperance movement showed up in the 1840s trying to change that, offering clean water and tea as healthier options. But convincing an exhausted guy to swap his mug of beer for a cup of tea? Almost impossible. Drinking was so baked into the routine that a lot of bosses paid part of wages in beer. It wasn't addiction, it was culture. And changing culture, as we know, takes generations. Number 8. In Victorian London, oysters weren't something only rich people ate. Quite the opposite. Street vendors sold cooked mussels, snails, and oysters for pennies on street corners. It was working-class fast food, with factories running day and night and thousands arriving from the countryside looking for jobs. These street sellers solved a basic problem. How do you feed so many people with so little money? The Thames and the British coast provided plenty of cheap protein. A worker could fill their belly spending almost nothing. Historians estimate that London ate about 500 million oysters a year at that time. There were so many that only decades later, with overfishing, oysters became a luxury item. Number 9. In the Victorian era, milk was basically Russian roulette in big cities. While families in the countryside milked fresh milk straight from the cow every day, people living in London or Manchester got a very different product. Dishonest vendors mixed dirty water into the milk to make it go further, and without refrigeration, the stuff went sour fast. The result was devastating. Thousands of children died from intestinal diseases because of contaminated milk. Cheese and butter were also too expensive for the average city worker. It was only when the railways started bringing fresh dairy from the countryside that things improved a bit. But that was already toward the end of the century. Number 10. Before 1870, fresh meat was a luxury for English workers. Then came a quiet revolution: refrigerated ships. All of a sudden, Argentine meat and Canadian wheat could cross oceans without spoiling. The result? By 1912, almost half of the meat eaten in England came from abroad. For the first time, poor families could eat beef regularly. It wasn't charity or politics. It was technology and free trade transforming the dinner table of the average worker. Historians call this the protein revolution. It sounds like an exaggeration, but think about it. An entire generation grew up taller and stronger than their parents simply because ships could keep meat chilled for weeks. Sometimes the biggest changes in history don't come from wars or kings. They come from an ice compressor in the belly of a ship. Number 11. In Victorian England, having dinner at a rich person's house was like watching a show. 5, 6, sometimes 10 different courses in a single meal. Roast meat, fish, elaborate puddings, and fruit that came by ship from the other side of the world. Meanwhile, working families got by on bread, potatoes, and, if they were lucky, a piece of bacon once a week. The contrast was brutal. In one night, an aristocrat would eat what a worker took days to put on the table. Food visibly separated the classes. You literally were what you could afford to eat, and the rich made a point of showing that off with every meal they served. Number 12. In Victorian England, middle-class families lived on a financial tightrope that few people imagine. Half of their paycheck went straight to the dinner table. Carrots, turnips, and potatoes filled the plates during the week. But on Sunday, there had to be meat. It wasn't luxury, it was social survival. Serving a roast beef to the neighbors meant you still belonged in that world. Falling to the level of the poor, who ate bread with lard day after day, was every housewife's nightmare. The plate on the table told the world who you were. Number 13. In Victorian England, organ meats like liver, kidneys, and brain showed up on every table, but in very different ways. The British elite turned these parts into delicacies served on fine china, while working-class families threw everything into a pot of water to make it stretch as much as possible. What's interesting is that the poor, without realizing it, ended up with a more nutritious diet. Doctors at the time noticed that kids from slums sometimes had less anemia than the children of shopkeepers who only ate prime cuts. Necessity created a use-everything style of cooking that today scientists recognize as surprisingly well-balanced by 19th century standards. Number 14. Ireland lost almost a quarter of its population in just one decade. When the blight wiped out potato crops in the 1840s, more than 1 million Irish people died from hunger and disease. Millions more fled to England and America. The problem was that the potato wasn't just food. It was basically the only source of nourishment for entire families. When it was gone, there was no plan B. Those who managed to escape to England depended on cheap grain and watered-down milk to survive. Many English people treated these refugees with contempt, blaming them for their own misery. It's a story that shows how a simple plant disease can change the fate of an entire nation. Number 15. In Victorian England, bread divided social classes in a way that seems absurd today. Workers ate a dark, heavy version made from poorly processed flour. The elite, on the other hand, demanded white bread, a status symbol. But here's the cruel detail. The government kept the corn laws in place, tariffs that made imported wheat more expensive to protect wealthy farmers. The result? Working families spent half their wages on bread alone. When Ireland faced the Great Famine in the 1840s, the pressure boiled over. In 1846, they finally repealed those laws. But millions had already gone hungry while politicians debated economics. Number 16. In Victorian England, sugar was a luxury item until the middle of the century. Workers sweetened their tea with cheap molasses when they could. But here's the interesting part. When sugar from the colonies became more affordable in the 1870s, poor people's dental health went downhill fast. Dentists at the time reported factory workers losing all their teeth before age 40. The paradox? That same sugar that wrecked smiles saved lives. For people working 14-hour shifts in factories, those quick calories made the difference between making it through the shift or passing out from hunger. It was a cruel trade-off Victorians were making without even realizing it. Number 17. In Victorian England, child poverty was brutal. Children from poor families ate whatever was left over. Rotten potatoes, vegetable peels, scraps that today we throw away without thinking twice. Malnutrition was so severe that 1 in 3 didn't make it to their 5th birthday. Doctors at the time documented cases of rickets and scurvy in working-class neighborhoods of London and Manchester. While the elite had afternoon tea with pastries, those children fought to survive on what was basically trash. The British Empire ruled the world, but couldn't feed its own children. Number 18. Back in Queen Victoria's time, a heavy breakfast became a serious thing. England's middle class started putting together hearty plates with eggs, bacon, and beans to power through long workdays. But here's the detail not many people talk about. Poor workers didn't have access to those ingredients. They improvised with stale bread and cooking fat, the famous drippings. It was basically cheap fuel to survive. What's interesting is that this humble breakfast worked. It gave enough energy for hours of manual labor. Over time, that habit crossed the ocean and influenced how Americans think about the first meal of the day even now. Number 19. In the Victorian era, laudanum was sold on every corner, no prescription needed. This liquid opiate cost less than bread and became the workers' medicine. Mothers gave drops to babies to stop the crying. Laborers mixed it into beer after 16-hour shifts. Hunger was pressing, but a few drops made the stomach forget. The government knew, doctors warned, but nobody enforced anything. It was convenient to have an exhausted population that didn't complain. Only in 1868 did the first law restricting sales appear, and even then, it was weak. Thousands had already become dependent without even understanding what was happening to their bodies. Number 20. It sounds strange, but farm workers in Victorian England lived longer than many city factory workers. The reason was simple: food. While factories paid miserable wages and urban food was adulterated with plaster and sawdust, poor farmers had access to fresh milk, eggs, and grains straight from the source. In the cities, entire families survived on cheap bread and watered-down tea. Doctors at the time already noticed that rural children grew up stronger, even with less money in their pockets. Industrialization brought jobs, but it also created a generation of malnourished workers. Sometimes, staying away from progress was the best recipe for staying alive. In the Victorian era, poor people ate bread adulterated with plaster and lime to make it look whiter. Meanwhile, the rich hosted 12-course banquets and threw away what they didn't finish. English workers lived on watered-down tea and leftovers they bought in underground markets. Hunger created recipes that still exist today, like bread pudding. Which fact surprised you the most? Comment below, turn on notifications, and subscribe to the channel.